Current GPU prices would put one high-end video card at about the same price to build our entire high-end rendering and editing PC when we built it a bit over a year ago. So it's reasonable to say that they've gone up a bit. Now, some of these are because of third-party sellers. Some of it is because of mining, although actually a lot less than current discourse would have you believe. And some of it's just supply, demand, and cycles in the industry annually. So this is a revisit of a video we did in July 2017. 6 months later, we asked the manufacturers and board partners again, how do you feel about mining? Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our coffee lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. So to recap the previous video very quickly, we had a few rules in place for that one. This is all anonymous and aggregate data. So we've spoken to the board partners, to manufacturers, we've spoken to power supply makers, a lot of people who are indirectly or directly involved in products that go to miners. And we've asked them for their thoughts either as an individual or as a representative of a large company that makes products used in mining, whether they intend them to be used there or not. The point of anonymizing it is twofold. One, they couldn't talk to us otherwise. And two, it allows people to speak their minds more freely. The point of aggregating it is so that it's just a big pool of information and everyone's isolated in what they said. So we may show B-roll of video cards during this video. If we do, it has no correlation with what I'm saying. The manufacturers shown in the B-roll may not have even been spoken to, and the video editor doesn't know which company said what anyway. So we've even isolated ourselves from the information. So if there's B-roll, it doesn't mean anything. Now, starting out, so let's look at the first company we spoke to for what do you think of miners 6 months later. These companies generally aligned with one another when we first did this video, and that remains mostly true now, only a couple of defectors. So the first company we spoke to said that there are a few factors playing into the current market. One, limited supply, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Two, end of year and holidays drying up supply anyway, and manufacturers never want to invest a lot in reviving or continuing a product line in the face of potential new launches, as happens every year. And then there's another aspect of this where once mining goes away, the miners aren't long-term customers. So this is a big one that we talked about in the first video. A few of the manufacturers we spoke to then, and the same ones now actually, suggested that miners are not brand loyal. There's two sides to this. A crypto miner will go out and find GPUs and buy them in whatever quantity they can get from whomever sells it, because those cards only do one thing, and the only thing you really need out of the card is that it's in stock. So this is not a customer that you have to use customer acquisition methods on. They don't really require marketing. They don't require advertising. They don't require buying incentives like $20 rebates. So that's the positive side of it from the manufacturer's perspective, from those we've spoken to. There's really no customer acquisition cost. The negative side of it is that these customers, mining buyers, are also not brand loyal. They don't care who you are or what you offer outside of a video card. There's no expansion into a greater ecosystem. And that goes with some of the other points we talked about in the first video that are still true today. For the vendors we've spoken with that sell multiple product lines, for example, perhaps they sell motherboards or monitors, peripherals, pretty much everyone sells peripherals at this point. Anything gamer targeted alongside their GPUs, the concern is that miners are not customers also of those components. So you may have a scenario where you've tipped the scales of GPU sales going up, but all the other products in the ecosystem aren't really selling quite as much as they typically would be in relation to the GPU sales. So the ratio of GPU to other components is now skewed, which is a potential problem depending on what they're selling and how much of it they're expecting to sell. Now, the same first company we spoke with is looking for long-term gaming customers, and it didn't really seem like just pandering either. It seemed pretty legitimate from a business sense in that With gaming users who buy a single or maybe 2 or 3 cards, and that's kind of it, you're looking at someone who, if they have a good experience with your company, they're very likely to buy from your company again because they have no reason not to. And if they've used customer service and it turned out positive, there's more reason to use your company again selling the GPUs. So long term, you're losing that with miners. And if they can't sell to gamers today, that's a problem. Now, another concern here, so we asked the obvious question, well, why don't you just make more cards? And speaking with everyone here, this is data from all of them, it sounds like none of the vendors really think that they are at least pushing Nvidia to the maximum GPU supply, meaning the vendors we've spoken to believe that Nvidia could supply more GPUs if the manufacturers did request more GPUs. However, the manufacturers are the ones who ultimately get stuck holding a bag if they can't sell them. So this happened in a couple years ago in one of the first crypto kind of booms and busts, where manufacturers who bet on crypto mining either did very well if they got in early or got burned bad if they got in a little too late right before a crash, because you have all the cards sitting on shelves in warehouses or coming back through return channels. So it's not as simple as just buying more, because purchases of GPUs with everyone we've spoken to pretty much happen from a quarterly analysis. So you look at what are your expectations for the quarter, let's buy based on that. And then from there, you either bet on crypto or you don't, and you just stick with what you would typically order for your volume moved and for your customers. And there's no real way to track miner versus gamer purchases for these board partners. So they don't have a good indication of how many to buy, and they're also generally concerned about being left with overstock where you've invested more than you make back. Here's where we diverge from mining, though. I said that mining was not as big a factor as we may have been led to believe, and part of that is supply. So you may have noticed that DRAM prices are anywhere from 2 to 4 times what they used to be. This plays into GPU prices as well, because the memory that is on GPUs comes out of the same 3 fabs pretty much that supply all of the system memory chips and all of the NAND for the most part. So you've really only got a couple manufacturers there. You have Micron, you have SK Hynix, and you have Samsung. And memory prices for DDR4 have gone up a lot. DDR3 gone up a lot. SSDs have increased in price. Well, GPUs also use memory. They've also increased in price. Now, some of this is from third-party or secondary sellers as opposed to primary markets. So when you're looking at prices online, be sure that you differentiate between the two. But from what we understand, and we've confirmed this with multiple of these vendors, GPU memory prices, GDDR5, have gone up for an 8 gigabyte card by about $20 to $30 in recent days. This is a much bigger movement in price, and this is cost. This is not what you pay. This is what the manufacturer pays. If they mark that up, you pay a whole lot more. So, and this is from direct sales as well, by the way. This isn't sold by AMD or Nvidia. These are direct contacts to the suppliers. So that's a big price movement. We asked what the typical price movement would be, maybe quarter to quarter. It's more around $5. So to go up to 20 to 30 is significant, and that increases the bill of materials cost, which could potentially increase what you pay, or it decreases the amount of incentives that are applied to GPUs for sale. Incentives would include rebates, instant discounts, free games, stuff like that. Those, if there's high demand, which there is right now, and cost has gone up, all of the incentives go away. So that's a lot of what we're seeing right now. Rebates are pretty much non-existent, and that's because they don't need to offer them. So that's something where mining has a direct impact, the supply costs have a direct impact, and gamers get burned for it. And actually miners would technically be paying a bit more as well, because they lose incentive offers if they even cared about them. And speaking with the companies, we also learned that, well, this is kind of obvious, but resale value of cards goes down with new architectures. So there's a point here where the longer mining holds up until a new architecture, it's kind of better for the manufacturers, because if mining stops being a thing or stops being profitable to the point where people are selling off their extra cards, that secondhand market gets flooded. Board partners can't sell as many devices when they're being sold secondhand for dirt cheap and people are buying them there. So there's actually a potential decrease in revenue or expected revenue as the secondhand market floods. And if the secondhand market floods, assuming mining at some point takes a dip, it would be better for the manufacturers, the board partners, if it's closer or after the release of a new architecture, because 10 series cards, 500 series cards, and Vega cards would be worth less secondhand than today. Whereas today, you're cutting closer to whatever the retail price is, as opposed to whatever the value is after new architecture ships with new features and speeds. One of the other vendors we spoke to really wanted to illustrate the difference between primary and secondary markets. So this is where they were pointing out to us that a lot of the high prices, as in the prices reported by some rumor mill websites of around $2,000, were actually from third-party sellers on Newegg Marketplace and on Amazon's third-party marketplace, as opposed to the first-party sales where the cards should be closer to MSRP, just without incentives. So manufacturers don't benefit from secondhand sales. We also asked, when do you all expect new shipments of cards? When should people be on the lookout for actual reasonably priced video cards? So they're ordering more every week. We know that a couple of the manufacturers are expecting a lot of supply at the time this video goes live this week. And so you should be on the lookout in the next couple of days or so. One thing that a couple of folks recommended is actually going retail instead of online. This makes a bit of sense. Retail, you can go to the store. They might be more expensive than online, but if you can't buy it online, it doesn't really matter. And ask the folks who work there, when's your next shipment, and then show up that day and get one. So it's kind of sad that's the recommendation, but that was the general recommendation to make sure you can get a card. So there are new shipments all the time. We were also told that there's no expectation that these new shipments will impact prices, and the best advice is try and get one immediately when they show up if you can. There was also, again, from this other manufacturer, concern about betting too much on mining in the event of a collapse, and noted that production cycles plus shipping time can be several months, and it's all based on quarterly projections. So even if a couple months ago they saw this coming, maybe in December, because in December prices were reasonable. So in December they see this supply shortage coming of video cards and say, you know, we need to order a lot more. Those probably still aren't in port. From personal experience, we know now, thanks to the mod mat, that if you're shipping by boat to save money, and it does save a lot of money versus air, you're looking at shipping times that could be upwards of 60 days. So, and that counts customs, that counts from the factory to the port, whatever needs to happen in China with that shipment, and then from the port to the port, that's obviously a long interval as well. And then you have customs, and then you have shipping to the warehouse, and then you have shipping to the customer. So it can take a long time, which all goes to say, if manufacturers bought in December in anticipation of today, those cards aren't here yet unless they're air shipping them, which in that case, the margin goes away very fast. And there's not a lot of margin on video cards either, assuming they're sold at reasonable prices. So no expectation that shipments are impacting price, and production cycles take a while, and shipping takes a while, so it'll be a bit before you see supply refresh fully. Price wouldn't drop unless orders exceeded demand anyway, even if supply is increased. So even if they're all buying more cards and GPUs, as long as there's a market that's split between gaming, mining, AI, everything else, because these cards can be used there as well, you're going to see high prices. Another vendor we spoke with thought that mining was a bit more of an issue than some of these others, who indicated more an issue on supply for memory going way up. And that vendor suggested that mining for altcoins is becoming more of a concern, especially for the lower end cards, I guess meaning non-TI, non-1080 or 64 class. So that same manufacturer had concern about other products in the ecosystem, as last time things targeted at gamers. If you're buying one board and 6+ cards, that's only one board sale. You might not be buying a monitor. You're certainly not buying a 144 hertz monitor. You're probably not buying a gaming keyboard and mouse or any of those other things. So that's a big concern as well. And let's go through the overall now. Overall, I suppose one of the bigger questions is, what would a company like Nvidia or AMD think? And one could assume that for Nvidia and AMD, just like all the board vendors, the biggest issue is being unpredictable and unstable. If this were a stable market, if crypto mining proved itself to be a something that will stay long term in its current capacity and its current demand, and this isn't saying that crypto won't stick around, it's saying that we don't know to what extent mining will stick around, especially for current cards. If there were stability there, they could account for this by increasing how many cards they're buying, how many GPUs they're buying, because then they wouldn't be worrying about, am I going to be left holding a 500-pound bag of video cards when it all collapses? So that's the biggest possible problem, is instability and unpredictable behavior in the market. And in addition to that, right now, it's just as much of a gamble for the manufacturers as it is for the crypto miners to buy the cards, because manufacturers, again, don't want to be left with them when new architectures are probably around the corner. So a couple things to go over here then. Mining isn't necessarily as much to blame as you'd think. There are other market factors at play. Memory cost is a gigantic one. $20 to $30 increase in bill of materials is significant, especially when you're expecting 5. So that's a big deal. And it sounds like the GPU makers could probably put out more GPUs if they were requested. It's just the board partners aren't buying them. So not as simple as saying Nvidia could make more GPUs or AMD could make GPUs in greater quantities, because yeah, they probably could, but someone's got to buy them. They're not just going to make them and leave them on the shelves. So that's it. I've seen some commentary online of this is Nvidia and AMD's fault for not making enough product. No, they have customers. They don't sell the card to you. Nvidia makes reference cards. They sell them in a quantity limit of 2. AMD, I don't know that they technically have reference cards. They don't really make them that much anymore. It's up to the board partners now. So in either case, you can't make more unless someone buys it. I mean, you could, but what's the point? So it's not quite that simple. So let's talk about the final point here, which is Nvidia and AMD as GPU makers. Despite significant reach in deep learning, data center, AI, automotive, and royalty sales, Nvidia still moves the vast majority of its revenue via gaming markets. It's actually quite significant. It's about 58% of Nvidia's total revenue is because of gaming GPUs. So from Nvidia's perspective, and speaking with people in the industry, or I should say assumed perspective anyway, the concern is that investors may see a decline in enthusiast PC adoption that is similar to the decline in consumer desktop PC adoption. So enthusiast is the only space where we've seen growth for desktop computers anytime in the last couple of years. And if suddenly there's a dip because gamers can't buy cards and RAM to build a computer, that's going to reflect poorly. Investors might get spooked and they might move their money elsewhere. So from Nvidia's and AMD's perspective, that is a potential concern, because enthusiast PC adoption is really the only fortress in a declining desktop market. So that's something to keep in mind, where, if you see desktop going down, why would you keep investing in gaming GPUs, especially when the company's revenue is 58% gaming GPUs. As for AMD, we know that AMD has publicly rebranded its now defunct Frontier Edition card as a blockchain pioneers card. So we know that they're definitely making a play there, which is reasonable. It is a market after all. Sadly, Frontier Edition is one of the most affordable video cards in the face of $2,000 Vega 64s, which just comes down to them being in stock for good reason. But we also know that RTG has invested considerable resources in gaming markets. The last 6 months, it's been drivers for gaming regularly. The most consistent drivers AMD has put out in a long time with all these gaming targeted features. So there's a lot to lose if that's not being leveraged by gamers. All of that goodwill, all of that effort is not getting really noticed by the audience that they've invested it for. So they also face new competition, both NVIDIA and AMD. Groups like TSMC, one of the major manufacturers of silicon, now serves mining companies like Bitmain. So if you've got more competition buying from your primary supplier for chips, price could play a bit there on the manufacturing side as well. So that all comes down to whether TSMC is at maximum capacity or not, though. But that should pretty much sum it up. So a bunch of thoughts. Very few of those were mine, except for kind of talking about stuff towards the end in some capacity, but most of that comes from manufacturers just kind of aggregated and anonymized for you. Overall, it would seem that a lot of the opinions are the same as 6 months ago when we spoke to them. Just now, I definitely got the sense, speaking with some representatives, that it's like, this is getting a little crazy. Like this 6 months ago, we were all so naive. Bitcoin went up to, what was it, $2,000 at the time? And that seemed high. And altcoins have exploded recently, hence why you get manufacturers saying altcoin mining is a potential concern for low-end cards. So, yeah, that said, though, it's not just mining either. It's memory prices, too. So there's a lot of things going on now that are driving up prices. So if you're trying to buy a GPU for gaming, they're coming in regularly. Shipments haven't stopped. Some manufacturers are betting bigger on mining than others. I'm not going to talk about who those are, but the point is keep an eye out every week because stock refreshes basically every week at this point. And if you have a store near you, just go there, make friends with the representative, and ask them when the cards are coming in, and just go buy it locally and pay the tax because it's going to be easier than waiting for retailers online. As far as retailers are concerned, they probably don't really care who buys the product because they're really just mercenaries in the space. They have unless the sale of GPUs does not outweigh the sale of everything else that goes into a computer, they have no reason to care either direction. So our conclusion here is pretty much the same as it was 6 months ago. People like power supply manufacturers are perfectly happy with all of this. They're selling more high wattage power supplies than they've ever sold. High wattage PSU sales were down thanks to the decrease in power needs by GPUs and CPUs, and now they're up because of mining. So they're quite happy with that. As far as the board partners, they're benefiting from immediate gains, immediate sales, because of the increased demand from two markets existing simultaneously, mining and gaming, but they're still concerned about long-term impact, and some companies are more afraid than others to bet hard on crypto mining, which means that they're not getting in really much more supply than they normally would, which is what gives us our current situation. That's it for this one. Subscribe for more as always. If you like this type of reporting, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, and you can buy a mod mat like this one at store.gamersnexus.net/modmat. I'll see you all next time. The card should be closer to MSRP, just without incentives.